Imagine a commander so fearless, so impossibly ambitious, that every nation he faced swore the gods themselves must have marched beside him. A young man whose armies crossed deserts no army should have crossed, stormed cities no force should have taken, and broke empires no mortal should have challenged. This is the story of Alexander the Great's impossible conquests. Victories so unlikely, historians still debate how they were even possible. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe for more epic history like this. Let's begin. Long before he became a legend, Alexander was simply a prince in the small kingdom of Macedon, an underdog realm ignored by the great powers of Greece. Yet from a young age, those around him sensed something unsettling, something extraordinary. He tamed a wild horse no adult warrior dared approach. He devoured the stories of Achilles as if they were personal prophecy. And with Aristotle as his tutor, he learned not just how to fight, but why civilizations rise and fall. When Alexander inherited the throne at just 20, Macedon stood on the edge of destruction. His father, King Philip II, had united the Greek city-states under Macedonian rule, but the alliance was fragile, and Philip's sudden assassination threatened to tear it apart. Rivals within the court doubted him. Foreign enemies assumed the kingdom would collapse. Instead, Alexander acted with terrifying speed. In a matter of months, he crushed rebellions, eliminated hostile factions, and secured his place as king. Yet even then, no one truly understood the scale of his ambition. Where others saw Greece as the center of the world, Alexander saw only a narrow beginning. His eyes were fixed across the Aegean Sea on the vast, ancient empire of Persia. It was a world the Greeks had feared for generations, a colossus stretching from Egypt to India. Most commanders would have sought alliances, negotiations, or peace. Alexander sought inevitability. Persia would fall, or he would die trying. But conquering Persia was more than a military gamble. It was a declaration of cosmic intent. For nearly 2 centuries, Persian kings held absolute authority over the greatest empire on earth. Their armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their wealth dwarfed that of any Greek state. By comparison, Alexander marched with an army small enough to fit inside a single Persian city. Yet his faith in his soldiers, and their faith in him, became a weapon more powerful than numbers. Alexander's army wasn't a massive force, but it was a masterpiece of precision. Macedonian phalanxes formed an unbreakable wall of spears. Elite companion cavalry, personally led by Alexander, struck with speed and shock rarely seen in ancient warfare. Every unit was trained to move, pivot, and kill as a single living organism. What the Persians lacked in unity, Alexander forged ruthlessly. And as he prepared to cross into Asia, he told his troops something unforgettable. You will be remembered for eternity. In 334 BCE, Alexander marched to the edge of the Hellespont, the narrow strait dividing Europe from Asia. Here, legend says he performed a symbolic act. He threw his spear into foreign soil and claimed the entire Persian Empire as his spoils. Whether the moment happened exactly as recorded doesn't matter. What matters is what his men felt. Their king was not simply invading another territory. He believed fate had chosen him to conquer the world. When his army reached the opposite shore, Alexander traveled to the ruins of ancient Troy. He honored Achilles, his supposed ancestor, tying his destiny to myth. To many soldiers, it was chilling. Their king was no longer just a general, he was a man stepping deliberately into legend. For them, the campaign ahead was no longer a political conflict. It was a heroic saga, and Alexander intended to carve his name into eternity with blood and fire. Their first true test came at the Battle of the Granicus. The Persian satraps, underestimating Alexander's daring, positioned themselves along a river with steep banks, believing no sane commander would attack head-on. But Alexander was not sane by their standards. Leading the charge himself, he plunged into the river, his men following with thunderous resolve. Against all logic, the Macedonians smashed the Persian defense, killing their commanders and scattering their armies. It was the first sign Alexander's impossible conquests had begun. In the aftermath, Greek cities under Persian rule welcomed him as a liberator. His momentum was unstoppable. Every victory emboldened him. Every challenge sharpened him. Persia, once a monolithic giant, now looked vulnerable. But if Alexander understood anything, it was that the hardest battles were still ahead. For at the heart of the Persian world stood King Darius III, a ruler who commanded tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, and whose defeat would require something beyond courage. It would require destiny. As Alexander pushed deeper into Asia Minor, he faced a truth every conqueror eventually meets: victory breeds resistance. Persian governors who once dismissed him now recognized the danger he posed. Cities fortified their walls, armies were raised in haste, and Darius III began assembling a force meant to crush the young invader once and for all. Yet Alexander moved with such speed and precision that the Persian high command struggled to understand, let alone counter, his strategy. The next major confrontation came at Issus, a narrow coastal plain where the mountains squeezed the land into a deadly bottleneck. Darius, expecting to trap the Macedonians, instead trapped himself. His massive army, far larger than Alexander's, had no space to maneuver. Alexander seized the advantage instantly. While his phalanx held the Persian center, he led the companion cavalry in a direct, lightning-fast assault toward Darius himself, a tactic almost suicidal unless executed with absolute discipline. The moment Alexander charged at the Persian king, panic rippled through the enemy ranks. Darius, stunned by the unexpected strike, fled the battlefield, abandoning his own mother, wife, and children in his haste to escape. It was a humiliation no great king had suffered in living memory. And for Alexander, it was proof that even the mightiest empire could collapse if struck at the heart. The impossible was beginning to look inevitable. But victory at Issus did not mean Persia would fall quickly. Darius still commanded enormous armies, and his empire possessed unimaginable wealth. Coastal cities resisted fiercely, especially those with strong naval power. Among them stood Tyre, a proud Phoenician fortress built on an island half a mile offshore. No land army in history had ever successfully taken it. Most commanders would have simply marched past. But Alexander refused to leave an unconquered symbol behind him. Tyre's walls rose straight from the sea, daring any attacker to try and breach them. Yet, instead of retreating, Alexander ordered the construction of an enormous causeway, a massive stone bridge stretching from the mainland to the island fortress. Day after day, Macedonian troops dumped rock, sand, and timber into the sea, inching closer under relentless missile fire. It was an engineering project so audacious that later historians called it madness disguised as strategy. Tyrians fought with desperate fury. They launched fire ships, sabotaged the causeway, and ambushed Macedonian engineers. But Alexander countered with siege towers taller than their walls, armored battering rams, and naval reinforcements seized from nearby ports. After 7 brutal months filled with fire, drownings, and relentless bombardment, the island's defenses finally crumbled. When Macedonian soldiers stormed through the breach, Tyre fell in a wave of blood and smoke. The world took notice. Alexander could take the impossible. But even as he claimed victory after victory, the shadow of Darius still loomed. Persia was not merely large, it was ancient, resilient, and deeply loyal to its kings. Darius knew that Alexander's true aim was nothing less than the throne of Persia itself. So he prepared one final gamble. He assembled the largest army he could muster, an ocean of soldiers drawn from every corner of the empire, hoping sheer numbers would wipe out the Macedonians once and for all. This final confrontation would take place on the plains of Gaugamela. Darius selected the location himself, ensuring the battlefield was wide open and perfect for his cavalry and chariots. Alexander recognized the trap instantly. He knew the Persian army outnumbered his own by terrifying margins. Some ancient sources claim Darius commanded hundreds of thousands. However uncertain the numbers, one fact is clear: the Macedonians were drastically outmatched. Logic declared they should lose. Yet Alexander's genius thrived in situations where logic failed. On the night before the battle, while the Persian camp roared with restless activity, Alexander let his men sleep. When his generals asked why he wasn't preparing them for war, Alexander replied calmly, "Darius has taken enough from them. I will not take their rest as well." It was a moment of quiet confidence, one that filled his troops with absolute faith before the storm. When sunrise broke, the field of Gaugamela stretched out like a nightmare, vast, flat, and shimmering with the scale of the Persian host. Darius's chariots, modified with siding blades, lined the front. Cavalry wings extended far beyond anything a Greek army had ever faced. But Alexander wasn't intimidated. He studied the battlefield, searching for the slightest weakness in the Persian formation. And somewhere between dust and destiny, he found it not in their strength, but in their overconfidence. The opening clash at Gaugamela erupted with terrifying intensity. Persian chariots thundered forward, their scything blades slicing the air as they charged toward the Macedonian lines. But Alexander had anticipated this exact moment. Instead of meeting the chariots head-on, his soldiers simply stepped aside, creating narrow lanes that funneled the horses harmlessly through. Once inside, the charioteers found themselves surrounded and swiftly cut down. Persia's fearsome weapon had been neutralized by nothing more than discipline and timing. Then came the cavalry. Persian riders, numbering in the tens of thousands, smashed into the Macedonian flanks, desperate to overwhelm the smaller force. Dust rose like a storm, and the battlefield became a chaotic blur of screaming horses, clashing spears, and desperate cries. Yet even here, Alexander's foresight prevailed. His infantry held firm, bending but never breaking. They fought not as individual soldiers, but as a living machine, each man trusting the one beside him with his life. And then, at the exact moment the Persians believed they were gaining ground, Alexander made his move. Spotting a gap forming near the Persian center, a weakness created by their own aggressive cavalry maneuver, he led the companion cavalry in a wedge formation straight toward Darius. It was a maneuver no Persian commander had expected, for no rational general would attack the enemy king with such a small force. But Alexander was not guided by reason, he was guided by opportunity. As the Macedonian wedge carved deeper into the Persian lines, panic rippled outward like a shockwave. Darius suddenly found his royal guard under direct threat. The great king faced a choice that would determine the fate of his empire: stand and fight, or flee and preserve the dynasty. For the second time in his life, he chose escape. His charioteer whipped the horses violently, racing away from the battlefield, abandoning command and collapsing Persian morale from within. The moment Darius fled, the Persian battle line fractured. Soldiers who had marched proudly under the banner of the great king now found themselves leaderless, trapped between Macedonian steel and the crushing weight of their own retreat. Alexander's men pressed forward relentlessly, cutting down elite units, capturing supply trains, and shattering the enormous army that had once threatened Greece itself. It was not simply a victory, it was the destruction of an imperial identity centuries old. When the dust finally settled, the scale of the Macedonian triumph became unmistakable. Against impossible odds, Alexander had defeated the largest army ever assembled in the ancient world. Military scholars still debate how he achieved it. Was it tactical genius, discipline, morale, or something more intangible, destiny, charisma, the psychological domination he wielded over his enemies? Whatever the explanation, the Battle of Gaugamela stands as one of history's most perfect victories. But Alexander was not satisfied with victory alone. He wanted legitimacy. He wanted the world to see him not as an invader, but as the rightful successor of the Persian kings. So after Gaugamela, he marched to Babylon, one of the greatest cities on earth. Instead of destruction, he offered restoration. Instead of pillaging, he honored local customs. Priests, nobles, and scholars welcomed him, astonished by his respect for their traditions. The conqueror was becoming a ruler. From Babylon, Alexander advanced to Susa and then Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia. There, the weight of his achievement truly dawned on him. The palaces built by Darius the Great and Xerxes, the halls where the mighty kings had proclaimed their authority, now stood open before a 25-year-old Macedonian. Even his own soldiers struggled to comprehend the scale of his triumph. They had marched into the heart of the world's greatest empire and won. Yet it was in Persepolis that Alexander faced one of the most controversial decisions of his life. During a night of drinking and celebration, someone, perhaps Alexander himself, perhaps one of his companions, suggested burning the city as revenge for Persian destruction in Greece a century earlier. Flames rose into the sky, consuming temples, palaces, and priceless art. As the smoke drifted, Alexander reportedly regretted the act, realizing he had destroyed something irreplaceable. Legend and guilt intertwined that night. But even with Persepolis in ashes and the Persian treasury in his hands, Alexander's journey was far from over. Darius, though defeated, was still alive, gathering what support he could. Alexander knew that as long as the great king breathed, the Persian nobility would view him as a usurper rather than a rightful ruler. The conquest of Persia demanded one final act, not just the defeat of an empire, but the confrontation with the man who embodied it. Alexander launched his pursuit of Darius with a relentless energy that astonished even his own generals. He marched his army across deserts, through mountain passes, and over vast plains at speeds no ancient leader had ever achieved. This was no longer a campaign for territory, it had become a hunt. Alexander believed that only by capturing Darius alive could he truly claim the mantle of Persian kingship. Each night, he slept in his armor, refusing comfort until the chase was complete. But fate intervened in a way neither king could predict. When Alexander finally caught up with the fleeing Persian court, he found chaos instead of battle. Darius had been betrayed by one of his own satraps, a noble named Bessus, who sought to claim the throne himself. In a desperate act of treachery, Bessus mortally wounded Darius and abandoned him by the roadside. Alexander arrived shortly after, finding the great king dying alone in a simple wagon, an end unworthy of a monarch. According to ancient accounts, Alexander covered Darius's body with his own cloak and promised a royal burial worthy of a king. Whether out of respect, political calculation, or a strange sense of kinship, the gesture marked a turning point in his life. With Darius dead, the last great obstacle to ruling Persia was gone. But with that victory came the burden of legitimacy. Alexander could now conquer lands, but he also had to rule them, a challenge no less demanding than war. As he continued eastward, Alexander encountered a world profoundly different from Greece or Persia. The further he marched, the more diverse and culturally complex his territories became. Instead of imposing a single rule, Alexander often adopted local customs, wearing Persian robes, respecting noble families, and marrying into local dynasties. To some of his Macedonian companions, this felt like betrayal. But Alexander saw it differently. He was no longer king of Macedon alone. He was shaping a new world entirely. Still, not all regions submitted willingly. In Bactria and Sogdia, regions corresponding to modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, Alexander faced fierce resistance. The terrain was brutal, the people fiercely independent, and guerrilla fighters constantly harassed his supply lines. One leader in particular stood out, Spitamines, a rebel commander whose ambushes caused immense casualties. Alexander, forced into a harsh, grinding war, found himself fighting not decisive battles, but a shadowy enemy who refused to face him openly. It was during this grueling period that Alexander met Roxana, the daughter of a nobleman in Sogdia. Their marriage shocked many of his officers, who believed the king should marry a Macedonian princess to secure the royal line. Instead, Alexander chose a foreign bride, further signaling his desire to merge cultures. Some saw it as a political union meant to pacify the East. Others believed it was a rare moment of genuine affection in a life defined by ambition. Despite constant resistance, Alexander ultimately crushed the rebellions in Central Asia through a combination of diplomacy, military pressure, and strategic brutality. He founded cities, many named Alexandria, to anchor Greek influence in the region. These settlements became centers of trade, learning, and cultural fusion. Yet every step eastward demanded more from his men. They had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and endured unimaginable hardships. Their loyalty was remarkable, but even the finest soldiers have limits. As Alexander approached the edge of the known world, his ambitions only grew. He had conquered the greatest empire of the age, but something inside him remained unsatisfied. Perhaps it was the constant comparison to mythical heroes like Achilles. Perhaps it was the thrill of breaking barriers no one had dared attempt. Or perhaps it was simply the intoxicating momentum of victory. Whatever the reason, Alexander now set his sights beyond Persia, toward the vast and mysterious lands of India. India was unlike anything the Macedonians had ever imagined. Its wealth, its forests, its rivers, and its elephant-mounted armies filled the Greeks with both awe and fear. Stories circulated of kings commanding beasts the size of fortresses and warriors who fought with unmatched courage. For the first time in years, Alexander's men questioned the path ahead. They had defeated Persia, but India was a world of its own, an unknown frontier where even their king's momentum might falter. Still, Alexander pressed on. He saw India not as a final conquest, but as another chapter in his unstoppable rise. To him, the edge of the world was not a boundary, but an invitation. And so, driven by ambition and perhaps a touch of madness, he led his weary but loyal army into the Punjab toward a confrontation that would test them in ways no Persian battle ever had. Ahead lay King Paris, war elephants, monsoon rains, and the battle that would push all of them to their limits. The Battle of the Hydaspes began under a sky darkened by monsoon clouds, the earth already softened to mud that pulled at the feet of every soldier. Paris, The king of the region waded across the river with his massive war elephants, towering beasts armored and trained for terror. Alexander studied the scene with rare hesitation. For the first time, he was not simply fighting an army. He was fighting nature, beasts, and a commander as stubborn as himself. To cross the flooded Hydaspes River without being crushed midstream by elephants required a strategy no general had ever attempted. So Alexander turned to deception. Night after night, he staged false marches upstream, confusing Paris until he could no longer track the Macedonian movements. Then, during a storm so loud it drowned marching footsteps, Alexander secretly ferried a portion of his army across the river. It was an extraordinary gamble, thinly stretched forces, deep mud, and an enemy waiting to strike. When Paris realized Alexander had crossed, he moved swiftly to engage. The clash was brutal beyond anything the Macedonians had faced. Elephants thundered into their ranks, tossing soldiers like dolls, crushing men beneath their massive feet. Horses panicked, infantry formations buckled, and for a moment, victory seemed impossible. Yet Alexander's troops, hardened by years of relentless campaigning, refused to break. They closed around the elephants, targeting their handlers, slowly turning chaos into opportunity. The turning point came when Alexander's cavalry encircled Porus's flanks, creating just enough pressure to unravel his battle line. Unlike Darius, however, Porus did not flee. He fought atop his elephant until he was wounded, exhausted, and surrounded. Impressed by such unshakable courage, Alexander approached the defeated king and reportedly asked, "How would you wish to be treated?" Porus answered simply, "Like a king." Alexander, struck by his dignity, granted him not punishment, but partnership. Yet even as he won the respect of kings and conquered lands beyond any Greek's imagination, Alexander's army reached its breaking point. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, his men refused to continue. They had marched nearly 11 years, thousands of miles through deserts, mountains, monsoons, and unending battles. They longed for home, for families they had not seen since Philip II was alive. For the first time, Alexander faced a battlefield he could not conquer, his soldiers' exhaustion. The decision to turn back crushed Alexander. He wept in private, furious that the edge of the world of which he had dreamed since childhood would remain unconquered. Still, he relented. The return journey, however, proved just as deadly as any battle. The Gedrosian desert swallowed thousands with heat and thirst. Supply shortages, disease, and hunger ravaged the ranks. Alexander led from the front, refusing water until his men could drink. But even his presence could not shield them from the desert's cruelty. When he finally returned to Persia, Alexander found an empire restless. Governors abused their power, rebellions simmered, and corruption spread like fire. He sought to unify his vast territories by blending Greek and Persian cultures, training Persians as soldiers, arranging mass marriages between Macedonian officers and local noblewomen, and planning new campaigns to Arabia. But these reforms sparked deep resentment among his veteran troops, who felt their identity dissolving in an empire too vast to comprehend. The strain took a heavy toll. Alexander grew increasingly erratic, drinking heavily, lashing out at friends, and making decisions clouded by grief and exhaustion. When his close companion and probable lover, Hephaestion, died unexpectedly, Alexander's grief shattered him. He isolated himself, threw extravagant funerals, and punished entire cities for perceived disrespect. The indomitable king who had never lost a battle now seemed at war with his own despair, lost in shadows no army could defeat. In June 323 BCE, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon, Alexander fell critically ill. The cause remains one of history's great mysteries: infection, poisoning, malaria, or exhaustion. Scholars still debate. For days, he drifted between fever and clarity, unable to speak, but fully aware that the empire he forged through impossible victories might shatter without him. When asked to whom he left his kingdom, ancient sources claim he whispered, "To the strongest." Whether true or legend, the words were prophetic. Alexander the Great died at just 32 years old, having conquered more of the world than any commander before or since. His empire fractured, his successors fought bitterly for his legacy, and his cities rose as centers of culture for centuries, yet the mystery of his impossible conquests endures. How did one man, with one small army, defeat the greatest empire of his age and reshape history forever? Some say genius, some say destiny. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between ambition and myth, where Alexander walked and where legends are born.